Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. It is June 29, 2016. Tonight is a review of a book called Leadership and Self-Deception, written by the Arbinger Institute. It's the sequel to a book that I'm going to be doing soon called The Anatomy of Peace, which is also by the Arbinger Institute. And so we begin with this, and I want to get this on the table at the outset. This is a difficult book to review. It's a book that I love. It's a book that we often recommend to parents. But it's a difficult one to do a review of because so much of it are various stories to illustrate the points and the principles. So like some of the things that I do, this webinar is an invitation to read the book. And maybe by giving you some kind of preview, it can get you more ready to hear and understand the principles of the book, because it can be complicated at points, but that's why the stories are so helpful. Another thing that I want to say on the outset is that I want to make the point that so much of what they talk about, although they use a very different set of theoretical ideas, concepts, they're really in line with a lot of the concepts that we talk about. They have different language, I should say, different terms, different vocabulary, but it's very similar to some of the stuff that we often talk about in these webinars. Some people, the books are the same. Leadership and Self-Deception and Anatomy of Peace are really the same books, same principles. This one comes in the context of a business, and then you're asked to apply it to home and to other relationships. The Anatomy of Peace talks about the family. The Leadership and Self-Deception book starts off with the former leader of a company by the name of Lou, who had dropped his child off at a wilderness program years before and had learned this life-altering philosophy. And then he brought this back to his company. And Lou's since retired, but the replacement for Lou is now teaching this to one of the senior executives over a couple of day period. So he's taking, in essence, a parent support group or a parent workshop that Evoke might do, and he's applying it to his business. So if you like that application, this can be a really good book for you. I go back and forth with what I prefer. I probably would recommend one over the other based on what the other person might be more inclined to understand. But if we can understand metaphor, if we can bypass our metaphorical impairment, we really see that they are teaching the same lesson. So with that preamble, I'll get right into it. Like I said, he starts off with a new employee. He states this, Bud is the name of the character, Bud states this idea as a way to improve efficiency in the company. It's very confusing to this senior executive because he sees himself as intelligent, as effective, as a powerful and rising star in this company. And so he's confused that when he's brought into this meeting, this 2-day meeting with his boss, that he's informed that if he doesn't understand this philosophy, that he might not make it at the company. So that's kind of where the book starts off. He's able to see that the way that he treats employees as objects or as people, he's able to see how sometimes he is abusive to other people and never sees his own contribution to the equation as a core violation of this company's ethics, this company's philosophy. He definitely comes in without a lot of humility. Underneath that lack of humility, or that humility that's missing, is an insecurity. Right? He's trying to prove himself. He's trying to impress his boss. And so when you're trying to impress somebody, when you're trying to look good, you tend to appear like you've already found the answer, like you already have it figured out. And when you do that, you're not as coachable and teachable. And I'll go back to that idea later on, that if you come in trying to impress, trying to show somebody what you have, what your stuff is, then you're going to be less teachable because that doesn't fit into that model. And he's asked to get rid of the old paradigms of right thinking. I was in the right, I was saying the right thing, right? He gives examples in the company of employees, people that he supervised, making mistakes, and they were mistakes, but still his reaction, his treatment of those employees in that context was still unhealthy and not okay. And again, we see the first application to families. It's not whether or not your children are doing the right or the wrong thing, right? I think most of us would agree that abusing drugs, sexual promiscuity, lack of safety, cutting on yourself, depression, anxious behaviors, school refusals, those kinds of things. We can all see that those are maladaptive, unhealthy, symptomatic, right? We can all see that those are wounded places to be operating from. But that doesn't define whether there's a problem here. in this model. The model is, how do we respond to it? Do we approach them and their humanity? Do we find a way to see them, to find them, to see them as people? Or do we see them as objects that we want to manipulate or change? Or at times, inadvertently, this is the most powerful maybe lesson of the book, at times, inadvertently, we actually become invested in other people acting out in the exact opposite ways that we think we want them to act out. That is, if I feel resentful for you being irresponsible and not kind and not happy, and I'm building up all this resentment, I'm inflating your flaws, and I'm inflating my virtues. If I'm committed to that, right, and I have to justify that, I'm going to look for things in you that are problematic. One of the characters in this book gives an example of a story of her either young adult or late teenage son who was having a problem with curfew. So he asked for the car on a Friday night, and she gave him what she called an impossibly early curfew to abide by, 10:30 at night. And of course the son agreed, and she sat down, after he left, fuming after he took the car, resentful, vowing to herself that she wasn't going to let him take the car anymore. And she was venting to her husband all evening. And about 10:29 in the evening, she heard the car pull up in the front driveway, and she looked at her watch. It was 10:29. And as he walked in the room, instead of congratulating him or complimenting him, she said, "Cutting it kind of close, aren't we?" And so she, because of her resentment, needed to see in him, needed to find justification for her resentment. She needed to disown her resentment and make it about him. And so we look for things in other people when we have those powerful feelings. While it's true that she's doing everything she can think of, the problem is precisely that she can't see how she's the problem. Having the problem she has, nothing she can think of will be a solution. And that's an idea that I really want to focus on tonight for parenting. If we can't see our problem, if we can't see our involvement in the problem, our piece of the problem, if we can't see our unhappiness, our frustration, our resentment, our anxiety as our problem, then nothing we try is going to be the solution. And that's very, very important. A lot of people come to me in relationship therapy, either a parent or a couple, and they'll complain to me about the other person. The presentation is, if you fix this other person, I will feel okay. But according to this philosophy, if they can't see their part of the problem or their unhappiness as their problem, their anger, their resentment as their problem, then they're never going to be able to solve it because the problem is in them, and that's the only place the solution can be. So they talk about this idea of self-deception. I'll give you an example, and then I'll illustrate using these small diagrams here. One of the characters, the new boss, Bud, describes an example where he and his wife had a new baby, and the baby woke up in the middle of the night. Bud had a bunch of important meetings the next day, and he was tired, and he had the first instinct he had when he woke up was, I should get up and take care of the baby. But he didn't want to do that, and so he neglected or denied that feeling, that impulse. And then he sat there while the baby was crying, and he had these thoughts. My wife is being lazy. I think she's really awake. She's not respecting the importance of my meaning. She's not really even a good mother. She's not a great partner. She doesn't care about me. He started to develop all these fantasies in his head, right? To justify his position, to justify what he calls self-betrayal. I had an instinct to get up and to help. I refused that instinct or didn't respond to that instinct. And then to justify my position, I have to develop a picture, a paradigm where my wife is being a bad mother, bad wife, and I am all too important, all too virtuous, a great husband, a caring husband. She doesn't even see how much I sacrifice for this family and how hard my work is, on and on and on and on. So when we deny, when we don't follow our instinct, when we don't know, when we don't do what we know to be right, we have to build this paradigm to justify our position. Another example that he gives is he gets on an airplane, and the plane wasn't yet sold out, and it was an open seating plane, and so he sat down by a window seat, set his briefcase on the middle seat, and then started reading a paper. And of course, as people were getting on the plane, he's watching over his newspaper and seeing the people come, and he's giving out the vibe that he wants to have his own space, his own extra chair. And in so doing, again, not seeing them as people with their needs, their need to rest, their need to find a seat to sit down in. He doesn't see other people as people, he sees them as objects. And this self-deceived place, this place where we see people as objects, is what they're calling in the book, in the box. That's when we are self-deceived. Out of the box is when we see people as people. So that's the basic language of the book. Self-betrayal and getting in the box. Can others put us in the box? How can I stay out of the box? One of the characters asks, as other people are in the box and keep putting me in the box. Nobody can put you in the box. People can invite you into the box by treating you from their own boxes, right? They can be cruel to you, unkind to you, insensitive to you, non-compassionate towards you, critical of you, right? They can look at you as a problem, and it can be easily a trigger for you to respond to them in very similar ways. But they can't put you in the box. And them being in the box doesn't mean that you have to be in the box. It's possible for somebody to show up in your life in a situation in the box and for you to see their pain, their sadness, their hurt, their fear, their insecurity. You can see their self-betrayal with compassion without taking it personally. So the important thing is, and this is really the simplest message, is you have the problem. And he gives examples in the book about dropping his son off, Lou does, at this wilderness therapy program, actually, and offended during the first parent meeting when they started talking about what the parent issues were. He says, wait a second, I have a responsible job, I'm successful, I don't do drugs, I've never been arrested like my son, right? He starts to justify, inflate his virtues, while of course focusing on the faults and flaws of his son. But in that position, he's in the box. In that position, he can't see, I've been impatient. I've been cruel at times. I haven't been compassionate. I haven't been present. I've been critical, on and on and on. Once you get to that place, once you can see that you're in the box and see that your serenity, your resentment, your anger, your frustration is your problem, nothing you'll do from that place will be unhealthy or unkind. And you'll be more effective in influencing other people. But if you're in the box, self-justifying, self-betrayed, then nothing you do, no technique, no behavior will get you out of the box. Because it wasn't behavior that got you in the box. What got you out of the box was this: how you feel, your relationship to others, your own sensibility with other people. So, knowing what you should do and not doing is what puts you in the box. Putting others in the box to justify your choices. A lot of people, a lot of characters in this book describe where other people in their lives, spouses and children, showed up in their lives in the box. And then that was a justification for them to be in their own box. And we make ourselves the victim when we do this. We see ourselves as justified or right? I didn't make that mistake. I'm not the reason that he's there. All those kinds of things. We tell those stories. I'm so glad they talk about in this book the idea that techniques are behavior. The question never is, what do you do? That's not what it is, because doing something can't get you out of it. Because if you're doing something from an in the blocks, a blaming place, it's going to be perceived as blame. There's a technical name for the insistent blindness I exhibited in San Francisco during one of the stories. Philosophers call it self-deception. At our company, we have a less technical name for it. We call it being in the box. In our way of talking, when we're self-deceived, we're in the box. I was stuck because I had a problem I didn't think I had, a problem I couldn't see. I could see matters only from my own closed perspective, and I was deeply resistant to any suggestion that the truth was otherwise. So I was in a box, cut off, closed up, and blind. He gave an example of where shortly, young in his professional and his family life, he was called from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco to work on a huge project. He just had a baby. It took him a little while to wrap things up and to get ready and to go out there. And he was going to be out there for an indefinite period of time. By the time he showed up, he was the last one to arrive. He said even the folks from London got there before he did. And so he was put on the 21st floor. The rest of the entire team was on the 25th floor. And so he worked day and night, hours from, I think he said, 6 a.m. to midnight every day, working on these drafts. But he kept missing meetings on the 25th floor. He also missed the fact that they were having food served at the 25th floor, and during lunch they were talking about it. He was going downstairs to the deli. And he was getting critiqued by his boss all the way along. because some of the discussions they had should have been incorporated into these new drafts, and he wasn't doing it, so he's being critiqued. And he started to build up this resentment, right? Like, it's not my fault. They put me on the 21st floor. I've been working all these hours. Right? They should be responsible. I'm working hard. I'm doing all this stuff. And so he started to inflate his virtues and become critical and blaming of the rest of the team. What he became aware of in this process is that he wasn't doing what it took. Right? He wasn't doing what it took to be on board, to be invested. He was distracted by his wife. He didn't want to be there. He was resentful. And that was the honest place. His boss was actually correct about all of his critiques of his work. And he was actually sabotaging it all the way along to justify all the anger, all the resentment that he had for being there. And once he could see that, he was out of the box. Once he could see that he was in the box, he was out of the box. And that's the same sentiment that I experience with families all the time. Once a parent says, I see my problem, I see how I'm not a good listener, I see how I wasn't a good father or a good mother, they're out of the box. They fear, of course, that if they focus on that, it's going to exonerate their child from their mistakes, and it doesn't do that. But we do feel differently about the child and their mistakes. But we can also have accountability. We can also have boundaries. We can also have rules. I've told the story many times about a father I was working with years ago whose son blamed him for not listening ever. And the father said, of course, I listened. I'm a great listener. I train listening at my job at work. And by the way, why would I listen to my son? He's a liar. He never tells me the truth. So they were both in the box with each other, right? And then after watching webinars and doing work around communication for 4 or 5 weeks, the father came to me about week 5 and said, I realized I never listen to anybody. I'm actually just formulating a rebuttal, a response, an argument. I'm getting triggered with a defense. And I said to him in that moment, I said, you're actually a much, much better listener now that you know that you think you aren't than you were when you thought you were a great listener. Just knowing how struggle, just knowing we're in the box all the time, all of us. Just knowing we have something to apologize for. Just knowing the harm that we do, the limited awareness that we have, just knowing all of those things in our relationships gets us out of the box. Gets us to a place of freedom and liberation. Gets us to a solution. So if he had in the example of getting up with his baby, if he had gotten up and tended the baby so his wife could sleep, for example, he saw her and her needs and he honored his feeling, he honored it, and he saw her as needs. But if he betrayed it, if he doesn't show up authentically, honestly, then he sees other people as objects. Like I said, techniques don't work. So one of the quotes from the book, and so you're saying then, Tom, that I was primarily responding to how Lou was regarding me, at least how I thought he was regarding me, and that his regard to me was more important than merely his words or his actions. Is that what you're saying? So he teaches this idea that the other person can sense unconsciously whether you're seeing them as a person, you're approaching them with compassion and understanding and humanity, versus if you're trying to manipulate them from a place of blame and anger and resentment and judgment. Right? And so how we think, this is what I talk about in the book, how we think about our children is much more important than what we say to them. That's why I always say, the question that you ask me, what do I do, is not the right question. The right question is, who am I and who is the other person? And what's my relationship to their problems? If we can unpack all of that and come at it from a place of awareness, intentionality, love, compassion, healing, all those things, we'll never do it wrong. And if we come at it from a place of judgment and blame and resentment and self-justification and self-aggrandizement, we'll never do it right no matter what the technique is. How I see others. In one of the examples, when the baby sleeping example, how he started to see himself was victim, hardworking, important, fair, sensitive, good dad, good husband. How I started to see my wife, lazy, inconsiderate, unappreciative, insensitive, faker, lazy mom, lousy wife. And those might be extreme examples, but I hope that you can see the parallels between those developing ideas about yourself and others as you do sometimes with your children, with my children, with your spouse, with your partner, with others in your life. That's how we see others when we're in the box. We inflate others' faults. We inflate our own virtue. We inflate the value of things to justify my self-betrayal, and we operate from a position of blame. They talk about this idea of collusion. It was the idea I said earlier where we need to keep people in a position of badness, of wrongness to justify our feelings of resentment. Like I said, inflating others' faults, inflating our own virtue, but going on, when I see a self-justifying world, my view of the world becomes distorted. So when I betray myself, I enter into the box. Over time, certain boxes become characteristics of me, and I carry them with me. Being in the box, I provoke others to be in the box also. So I actually, and this is the most powerful, maybe, hypothesis in the book, is according to this philosophy, and I can see it, we get invested in our children acting out and being broken. We get invested in other people in our lives, unconsciously. It's the exact opposite of what all of us would say that we want them to be. The mother whose son was late, if you had asked her, she would have said, I want my son to be responsible, respectful, cooperative, mature. But of course, everything she was doing was putting him in a box so that she could stay in a box and be resentful, angry, and blaming. How do you get out of the box with other people? You look at yourself. You forget yourself. By forget yourself, what they mean is you don't try to come across as out of the box. You don't try to come across as compassionate or justifying. You don't worry about your image. You don't try to look good. He gave the example at work, for example. If you want to look smart and intelligent and learned, how are you going to react to somebody who comes in and has something to teach you? You're going to be defensive. You're going to be offended. Right? I say that all the time to my new employees. We've already hired you. If you try to impress me, and it's hard not to, as your boss, if you try to impress me, you're going to miss the opportunity to learn some of the things that I might have to teach you. We've already hired you. We already like you. But you don't need to impress me. And when I give this speech, and I give it all the time to our new therapists, they'll often say to me, I'm there, I got it, and then it still happens, right? They want to impress their boss. They want to look good. And that gets in the way of the teaching process. So learning to forget yourself is forgetting about your own image. Learning to listen, of course. Listen to other people. That's why when we talk about communication skills, although listening can't get you out of the box, if you're listening to get out of the box, you're still in the box, right? I gave that example one time with this father who, when I was teaching about the listening skill, gave the example back to me. He said, I went to my daughter, I tried the listening skill, and she was still mad at me. She was still angry. And I said, so you weren't listening to listen. You were listening to change her. Right? You weren't listening because you realized, gosh, I'm not a very good listener. I don't really understand my daughter. I want to open up. That's out of the box. You were listening to try to manipulate her. You were treating her like an object to get her to change. And she could still sense that from you. So we listen for the sake of listening to understand. We allow ourselves to be asked tough questions. We ask ourselves tough questions. I've said this a lot recently. I don't think you can do that without a therapist or a sponsor, a good sponsor. Sponsors are free. Therapists, of course, you pay for. I don't think you can do this by reading books. I don't think you can do this alone by watching webinars, even though they're somewhat interactive. I don't think you can do it merely by those activities. There's no substitute for a relationship with somebody else who can dialogue with you, who can work with you, ask you difficult questions to look at yourself in the process. Of course, when we're out of the box, we are inclined to take care of others' needs, to see their needs and be sensitive to them, right? If I'm driving on the seat and somebody cuts in front of me and I'm in the box, I see them as rude, disrespectful, stupid, incompetent driver. Right? But if I'm aware, if I'm out of the box at that moment in my life and with the others close to me, around me, then I'm going to see them as somebody that might be late, somebody that might be having a difficult day, in a hurry for something, all kinds of potential limitations in their life. That's being out of the box with them. So I'm responsive and kind in response to their needs. Of course, being humble, being teachable. I think with parents, the way that I would have you think about that is be teachable when it comes to this work, no matter what you're at. It doesn't mean that you take everything that every therapist says. I just got back from a therapy appointment with my 14-year-old daughter and my wife, family therapy session, just right before I started this. And I didn't agree with every idea that the therapist had, but I was open, and I listened, and I tried it on, and some of it felt right on, spot on. And a couple of things I thought, well, that doesn't really fit for me. And because he's a good therapist, he wasn't trying to impose it. He was just asking me questions, asking me to look at it. And I actually did change my position on something by the time I left, with a major decision that we were trying to make as a family. Focusing on your own change. That's the key. I mean, I say that about as much as I say anything, right? That's the way to be out of the box. So what are the take-home messages? Be a leader for change in your family. Be a leader for change in your organization. Be the one who is aware of his or her limitations and need for change as much as or more than anybody. And although that might be frightening to many parents because, again, they're afraid that their children are going to use it against them, my answer is they can't. Your children can't use your authenticity and your vulnerability against you unless you let them. Because when you're out of the box, you're not asking for something back. You're not needing them to show up a certain way. You're not asking for credit or to be seen a certain way. You're just being real. It might hurt if they try to use it against you, but it's not going to work in the sense that you're going to be manipulated by it. Practicing vulnerability. A lot of what they ask you to do, it's a very intellectual book. It's a very logical book. But maybe the more difficult emotional process that it asks of us is to be vulnerable, to let go of control, to focus on our own faults and flaws. Assume that you have a part of the equation. Remembering no behavior can get you out of the box, but when you're out of the box, any behavior that you do, anything you do, is going to be more effective. And nothing you do in the box will work. Like I talked about with codependency, if we're in a codependent relationship, if I'm trying to control you, nothing I say or do is likely to be any good. If I'm not trying to control you, then it's hard to get it wrong. And anything you do out of the box will work. I wanted to end with this quote tonight because I thought it's not perfectly related, but I think it's a powerful statement from Brene Brown that somebody sent to me this week. I think midlife is when the universe gently places her hands upon your shoulders, pulls you close, and whispers in your ear, I'm not screwing around. It's time. All of this pretending and performing, these coping mechanisms that you've developed to protect yourself from feeling inadequate and getting hurt has to go. Your armor is preventing you from growing into your gifts. I understand that you needed these protections when you were small. I understand that you believed your armor could help you secure all the things you needed to feel worthy of love and belonging. But you're still searching, and you're more lost than ever. Time is growing short. There are unexplored adventures ahead of you. You can't live the rest of your life worried about what other people think. You were born worthy of love and belonging. Courage and daring are coursing through you. You were made to live and love with your whole heart. It's time to show up and be seen. The reason that I like this quote is because I think that what our children are teaching us, and most of us, because we have adolescent and young adult children, are somewhere in that midlife area. It's my belief that that's what this event is asking of all of us. It's inviting all of us into what Brene Brown is talking about. It's inviting us to let down our walls, to heal our wounds, to be courageous, to do the work that we need to do to recognize that we've always been worthy of love, and trying to prove ourselves, trying to impress other people, trying to be good when we already were good. It is a waste of our energy. So I thought it was an appropriate kind of reading at the end of this to pull it all together into a real human way. All right, I'm open for any live questions. Like I said, I hope if you're interested in the book, it's a hard one to talk about, to teach, but I hope, if nothing else, it's an invitation to read it. I'll go over some upcoming announcements. We've closed the July and the August personal workshops, so we have one in September. If you're interested in doing some deeper work, this exact kind of work, then sign up for that. We have 6 spots per group of the individual groups, the Finding You group, so let us know. The Untitled Parent Workshop is the next one on July 16th and 17th. We would like every current parent to go to a workshop. I've listed all the ones for the rest of the year and even on into January at both of our locations. You have the contact information there below. These 12-step support groups are free. We implore you to attend 6 of these while your children are with us. These are groups that are perfect for helping you stay out of the box in your life and in relationships to other people. I'm going to come, I put some tentative dates on here because I have to formally book them, but I'm thinking of Toronto the week of the 24th and Los Angeles the week of the 7th. We're going to do a Sunday in Los Angeles this time so people don't have to fight traffic. Northern California is coming right up, followed by New York City and Chicago. So please put those on your calendar for some time ahead. Social media, follow us on social media so you can be updated with announcements and inspirational quotes and pictures. Our Pursuits Adventure Trip, go to our website. We have scheduled trips that just came out. Go to our website for those. The book is on paperback or audio. Also go to our Parent Alumni book page to buy books from Amazon at the same price, and 10% goes to charity to help families who can't afford treatment. All right, any topic, any questions come in? It is more worthwhile to read this book or the other one you mentioned. Gosh, that's really good. The Anatomy of Peace is the prequel that was written second. Personally, I like The Anatomy of Peace better. But I've heard just about as many people like the Leadership and Self-Deception book better than The Anatomy of Peace, but they're very similar. I would say this. If you like thinking in terms of a business metaphor, if you like a really, really logical book, if that's how you're wired, is to think really logically, read the Leadership and Self-Deception book. If you want one that's more specifically applicable to families, so there's not as much metaphor, and you like something that's a little bit less logical, then read The Anatomy of Peace. I suspect when you read one, you'll read the other. I read this Leadership and Self-Deception book first because it came out first, and then when The Anatomy of Peace came out in I think 2006 or 7, I read that one, and I really like them both. I would recommend either one of them to use, but Leadership and Self-Deception, more logical. Business model is the primary metaphor. Anatomy of Peace is less logical, more storytelling, and more family-oriented. But the challenge with the family-oriented one is that the less metaphorical something is, the more we might be threatened by it. If you just tell me the truth about me without using a metaphor, I can be defensive. So sometimes metaphor is helpful to bypass somebody's defenses, but that's the best I can say about them. Definitely read one of them if you haven't during your course of parenting and working with your child and working with relationships. I have read Anatomy of Peace, as the treatment center my son has been at uses it as the basis for their work. Also, my therapist uses what this book teaches. It's really hard. I know when I'm in the box and have used the box as an armor. My question, how does past trauma affect a person's ability to get and stay out of the box? That's a good question. And they don't talk well about it in the book because they're not psychologists. They're philosophers, really. The people who have written this book are philosophers, and so they're not psychologists. And so sometimes that's a piece of it that I think is missing. I think what happens when I'm carrying a lot of unprocessed, unresolved trauma is my primitive brain is more active, and so I'm more easily threatened. And when I'm more easily threatened by other people, I'm more apt to put up this armor. I'm more apt to stay in a blaming, resentful place because everything is scary to me. And so sometimes trauma triggers our getting in the box, that self-justifying, resentful, I'm a victim, I'm a good person place because we're so threatened by the stimulus, by the environment around us. So I would just say it's just harder. That's the answer. We all have trauma at some level, some of us less than others. But the answer is the more trauma we have, the less healed our trauma is, the more easily we are triggered to be in the box with other people in our lives and to be a victim and to be blaming and to try to justify ourselves and to try to inflate our virtues because we feel so threatened and insecure by everything and everybody around us. That's the simplest way I can put it. Great question. I also, can I make a critique of this too? I want to read that in just a second. Well, I'll read that and then I'll make a critique. Let me make the critique first because I'm going to lose it if I don't make it. The critique of the book is that it's a great metaphor. I agree with it. But there's an implication in it that teaching somebody information changes them. It's not my experience. It can augment change. It can anchor or be a reference point for change. But the therapeutic experience is much more than that. One thing in the book that they do talk about is the way that the mentors in the book talk to the mentee in the book is with compassion, is with understanding, is with they're self-effacing and they're humble and they use their own examples of making mistakes and admit that they're in the box all the time, still in their lives. And in that way, they're approachable and they're healing and they're disarming to the mentee in the book. But I think the thing that I think the Arbinger Institute misses sometimes is that therapy is not just about acquiring information, that we actually have to heal that trauma. And that healing takes more than just information. It takes an experience. And it takes a different kind of experience than the original trauma occurred in. And although they illustrate that a little bit in the book, they don't teach it because they're not therapists. They're not psychologists necessarily. Like I said, they're philosophers. My biggest box must be seen as. I have a very similar box. My biggest box is not being seen, which is similar to not being seen as something. I realize that much of the time I'm getting angry or agitated with other people, it's because I feel invisible. I don't feel seen. I don't feel recognized for who I am and what I am. And when I'm either taking care of that need because I'm going to therapy or I'm doing other self-care, right? I'm not as stressed out. I'm more regulated. When I'm taking care of that need, I'm much more patient and compassionate with other people. But when that need is starved somewhat, is neglected somewhat, other people can easily trigger me. I can be easily triggered because I'm needing that from them at the moment, and they're not able to give it to me, obviously. And that could even be with my children. Knowing you're in the box is being out of the box, by the way. That's important. Knowing that you're in this self-justifying, self-deceived place is being out of the box. So you're already out of it when you can know that about yourself. Our son is back for a brief visit. I found myself listening to his phone conversation and even confronted him when he was having a conversation with a friend and I feared he was being offered drugs. Did I get in my box? You know, they said this in the book, and I'll say the same thing. I don't know. You can ask yourself that. I think what I fear is that you were trying to manage and control him. So yes, maybe you were in the box. You know, it depends on how you approached it. It depends if you're in a place of trying to be right, of trying to think he was broken, of thinking that you needed to manage him, of thinking that the problem was in him, instead of really looking at your problem. If you stumbled across the conversation, if you realize that your fear was probably getting you into a codependent, I gotta fix it, I gotta control it place. If your fear of him relapsing was so severe that you started to get into that place of being the detective and being in charge of his sobriety, recovery, so on and so forth. Your fear of relapse was that it couldn't possibly be recovered from all those things. You ask yourself those questions as you go along. It's suspicious. I'm suspicious and skeptical of eavesdropping on somebody else's phone call for sure. That's the best way I can put it. I'm very skeptical of it. But as you read this book, if you read this book, they say all the time, you need to ask yourself the question. And that's a cool thing about this book, is that I can't tell you if you're codependent. I can't tell you if you're in the box. I can ask you questions that make it obvious, that illustrate where you are. But you have to practice courageous, ruthless self-honesty to figure it out. I'm suspicious, as are you, in this. All right. It's kind of a short one tonight. Next one will be the book Way of the Peaceful Warrior, a book that we often give to our clients. It won't be till Thursday. I'm off on the 4th, and I have events on Tuesday and Wednesday that I'll be at. So it'll be Thursday the 7th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, So it's a really, really great book that a lot of our clients love. Great metaphor. Very different kind of story than the one that I went over tonight, but of course very similar and overlapping principles. Have a great and safe weekend this weekend. Take care, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.